for what they missed, because I know I freaked some people out by making assignments live last night and then changing things up today. So see, maybe I should give people 30 seconds to log on. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I wanted to address the freak out. I just went, I made stuff live on Canvas. That's not due right away, right? If you look at Canvas, we're in week 11, right? So this week you have a discussion board post with just 2 questions. So we'll answer question 2 today. And then, let's see. Then week 12, we're gonna talk about basically Roe v. Wade and continue talking about reproductive politics. Then week 13 is the week before Thanksgiving break. And that week, on that Sunday, your final draft of the racism in nursing paper is due. So for most of you, I think it's going to be very doable. I still have a handful more of papers to grade. So if you haven't received your grade on your rough draft, you will get that tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest. So don't despair quite yet. And I'm liking everything I'm seeing. So one, everybody has things to change for their final draft, but a lot of you like really took this rough draft seriously. And that is fantastic, because what that means is that your final draft is going to require a lot less work. That's why I've also been spending a lot of time on these rough drafts, why it's taking longer to grade them, because I'm going in and giving you like wording suggestions. Right. And I do want to make it clear, those are just suggestions. You're not obligated to use my suggestions, but it's a place to start. And for those of you that have a little bit more work to do on them, you want to start sprinkling it in when you have a little bit of time, like in between classes, in between doing things on the computer. Squeeze some of that in, because it'll help you get through that final draft earlier. Right. And then we have Thanksgiving break. So that final draft is going to be due the Sunday right before the Thanksgiving break. Then once we come back from Thanksgiving, we have 2 weeks left. And both of those weeks will be spent focusing on the final paper. I am assigning you a paper instead of a final exam, right? And it's going to be a 2-page paper. So a much smaller paper than the racism in nursing paper. But most people are going to probably end up writing more, because I'm going to have you watch a documentary. The documentary is on forced sterilizations. And basically, I'm just asking you to explain why these kinds of things keep happening in history. Right? I'm not asking you to solve the problem of forced sterilization, but to offer an idea of why they keep happening in the context of all the things we've been learning in this class. Right. So I'm mentioning that not because I think you need to be already thinking about it, but because today I'm going to start talking about forced sterilizations. And so you want to make sure that you have good notes on this, so that once it gets time to write your final paper, that you have all your notes in order and you know exactly where to go for the information to write that paper. That's it. Like, that's really the main reason why I made everything live. I was not trying to freak anybody out. This week, all you have is 2 questions, 2 discussion board questions. See what's, so that's the final. Yes, it's the belly of the beast paper. Yes. And so if there are a few of you who have been working early on assignments, the reason I made the prompt live is that you could start it early if you want it. Right? It's not a requirement by any means, and I'm not telling you to do that yet, but it is up there so that you can plan ahead. So for those of you that are freshmen in the class, by the way, because I know I have a handful of freshmen in this class, for final exams, our final exam schedule is live on Get. So you can see which day and time you have a scheduled final exam for each class. Now, not everybody does an actual final exam. right? Some people like me, I do a final paper, and for the Belly of the Beast paper is going to be due the day of your final exam in this class, like the day we're scheduled to have it. For this class, we're scheduled for Wednesday, December 14th. So I'm going to make it Wednesday, December 14th by midnight, that Belly of the Beast paper is going to be due, right? The reason you want to be aware of this final exam schedule right now is that from time to time, they try not to do this, but from time to time, they make two different final exams due in the same day and time. So if you have two classes where you have to show up in person to take a final exam, then you want to make sure you talk to the professors. You just need to tell them that you have a time conflict, and professors will work with you to give you an alternate time or day for a final exam in one of those classes, right? So instead of having to come in and take an exam, you just have to submit your paper on Wednesday of final exams week. Anyone just joining, please don't freak out. I made the prompt for the final paper live, and that's all I'm saying right now. Okay. Any questions right now? It's still over a month ahead. It's only November 2nd, so you don't need to be worried about final exams yet. Okay, let's finish up talking about the Black Panthers, because you all wanted to finish seeing that documentary from Vox on YouTube, and I wanted to continue playing. So just to recap where we left off, the Black Panther parties had been really vilified, and I don't think by any means that the Black Panthers were a perfect organization. They were far from it. But there was a lot of good work that they were doing that was not recognized at the time. And because we're not taught about them unless you grew up in one of the communities in which they had a very significant presence, you just don't learn about them. And for a lot of you that are into politics, that might be activists, I think this is one of the organizations that you need to know about, right? In addition, a lot of the things that were happening in the 60s and 70s sound like conspiracy theories, but the problem is they're not, right? A lot of the FBI paperwork from the time has now been made public, not everything, but a lot of it. So we know that like civil rights leaders were being wiretapped. Everyone, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, their families, their friends, their colleagues, they all had their phones tapped. In addition, a lot of the Black Power organizations and leaders also had their organizations infiltrated by the FBI. There were informants within the FBI, and that plays a role. So the FBI plays a role in destroying some of these organizations, right? So what we're going to watch now is basically the documentary talking about how the FBI's involvement in the death of Fred Hampton, who was one of the Black Panther leaders and the head of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and play the rest of the documentary. I'm rewinding a little bit from where we left off, but not much.
Resonated. It was then the second largest American city, and due to decades of discriminatory policies, also one of the most segregated. Chicago's mayor at the time, Richard J. Daley, opposed neighborhood integration. And in the 1950s, the city had begun to redevelop certain neighborhoods, pushing low-income residents out and into densely packed, high-rise public housing in already overcrowded neighborhoods. Black people were pushed primarily to the south and west side of Chicago. A large Puerto Rican population was here in Lincoln Park, and poor white people were concentrated here in Uptown. These groups all faced similar problems.
They all had dilapidated schools, they all had dilapidated homes, they were all being drafted into Vietnam. Very few of those communities had health care.
In 1969, Hampton led the Panthers towards an unexpected alliance, a coalition of activists working across racial lines against a corrupt city government that threatened their communities.
We're gonna fight racism, not racism, but we're gonna fight with solidarity.
What they had in common was their poverty. So they was building a revolution based on class solidarity that transcends race, that they all had the same hell to pay.
Hampton named the group the Rainbow Coalition, It included the Black Panthers, a Puerto Rican group called the Young Lords, and a group called the Young Patriots, made up of largely poor white migrants from Appalachia who had moved to Chicago seeking economic opportunity.
We don't hate the motherfucking white people, we hate the oppressor, whether he be white, black, brown, or yellow. So we got to know that.
I don't mean sing Kumbaya and make a quilt. I'm talking about bringing them together on common things they could unite on. Not everything, but who could say that children do not deserve to have a healthy meal?
We work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism.
Hampton and other Panthers helped the Young Lords and Young Patriots launch their own social programs. They organized protests together. And it was working. Members were traveling across the country to organize Rainbow Coalition chapters.
Particularly where Black Panther chapters were, but also in these rural white communities as well, to bring the revolution to bear. This blows people's minds. These people are not supposed to get along, but here they are operating as brothers of the struggles, as revolutionaries against the capitalist structure. And that was the threat to the state at the local level, but also at the national level.
In 1968, the FBI had sent around this internal memo. It outlined goals to prevent the coalition of militant Black nationalist groups and prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. It wasn't written about Hampton specifically, but by 1969,
Chairman Fred Hampton was the one that fit the bill.
The revolution was in the air. And the ways in which the Panthers was able to transcend those racial lines, especially the charismatic leadership of one like Fred Hampton, they saw him as a greater threat even than Martin Luther King or Malcolm X ever was.
in one FBI memo about the Black Panthers' breakfast program, they claimed their real purpose was to poison minds with anti-white propaganda and indoctrinate youngsters in hate and violence.
The FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, had deemed the Black Panther Party as the #1 threat to the internal security of this country.
The FBI operated a counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO. It was a program that targeted dissident political groups in the U.S. Their methods typically went outside the law.
They were using tactics such as assassination, discrediting false narratives. They were falsely putting people in prison and exile, which were all illegal.
Several Black Panthers were killed or imprisoned, including the party co-founders. In Chicago, the party was also targeted by Mayor Daley and the Chicago police.
Our office was burned down at least 3 times. People would disappear. You never see their bodies again.
Before you go to bed tonight, say I am a revolutionary. Make that the last word. In case you don't wake up, then somebody might believe it and you might, end up in what they call a revolutionary happy hunting grounds.
Hampton, a rising star at just 21 years old, knew he was a target too. He'd been arrested in 1968 for allegedly robbing an ice cream truck and handing out $71 of ice cream. In 1969, he was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison. He appealed and was released on bond, but lost the appeal. He'd have to return to prison by December 6th. On December 4th, around 4 a.m., 14 Chicago police officers arrived outside Hampton's apartment on Chicago's west side. Inside, Hampton, Njeri, and 7 other Panthers were asleep.
I was very pregnant, and the first thing I remember was Chairman Fred had fell asleep while talking on the phone. The next thing I remember was someone in our room.
Start shaking the chair.
Chairman, wake up, the pigs are vamping. And I'm seeing Chairman Fred look up, and then he laid his head back down real slow.
Officers kicked open the door and shot Mark Clark, a visitor from another party chapter. They shot a sleeping 18-year-old named Brenda Harris. Then they shot in the direction of Hampton's bed.
Mattress is just going. You could feel the bullets going into it.
I had moved over on top of Chairman Fred because there was shooting into our mattress. The person that had come into the room kept shouting, stop shooting, we have a pregnant sister in here. Eventually, the shooting stopped.
And Jerry was forced into the kitchen when she heard another voice.
Someone said he's barely alive.
He'll barely make it. I assume they were talking about Chairman Fred. Pig said, he's good and dead now.
As they took me out and jammed a revolver to my stomach as I was handcuffed behind my back, I didn't look towards our bedroom because I didn't know what I would see or how I would respond.
The police fired nearly 100 shots. Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were dead. The 7 surviving Panthers were arrested. And police smiled as they removed Hampton's body from the scene. The Chicago police and the state's attorney's office quickly shaped the narrative to call it a gunfight, a battle, and a shootout.
Officers involved in the raid testified that they were fired on from 4 different rooms in the apartment by shotgun.
And before I could get past the threshold, there were 3 shots fired from the rear bedroom.
They played back a story that you could not even fathom. They gave a fictional account of what happened, again vilifying the Black Panther Party.
I mean, they were firing at police?
Yes, sir. We saw the shots coming out of the 2 bedrooms.
This attack by the Black Panthers on the police clearly demonstrates the true character of the Black Panther Party.
But experts and lawyers hired by the Panthers, along with other journalists, inspected the crime scene. The Panthers even opened the apartment so that anyone could examine it. And a drastically different picture emerged. It was clear that the police had fired unprovoked. Of the nearly 100 shots fired, only one possible shot could have come from a Panther's gun, likely from Mark Clark at the front door. The bullet holes that the police said came from Black Panthers were nail heads. Later, it also emerged that the FBI had assisted Chicago police with the raid. The FBI had an informant within the Black Panther Party named William O'Neill, who had become chief of security and Hampton's bodyguard. O'Neill had provided the FBI with a hand-drawn floor plan of the apartment, which the FBI then gave to Chicago police. And evidence strongly suggests that before the raid, O'Neill had drugged Hampton. In the years after Hampton's assassination, the police and the FBI continued to imprison dozens of party members across the country. The official Black Panther Party would continue to exist until 1982, but membership decreased dramatically, and it would never be the same.
And I hope that each one of you will be able to die in the international proletarian revolutionary struggle, or you didn't be able to live in it. And I think that struggle is going to come. Why don't you live for the people? Why don't you struggle for the people? Why don't you die for the people?
Fred Hampton wanted revolution. Those in power wanted to destroy him and what he stood for. But they weren't totally successful.
Chairman Fred lives. You know what I'm saying? Through the military assault, through the destruction of the party as an organization itself, you know, by the state, the legacy of the party is still here.
Today, the work of Fred Hampton is alive through some of the same programs that marked him as a threat.
Many of the programs that the Panthers created are now staples of our society. We didn't have free breakfast in schools prior to the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program. Those free clinics, almost every major college campus got a free legal aid clinic. The ways in which sickle cell testing is now respected as a disease by the CDC and others. None of that stuff existed before the party. I think that's revolutionary.
The history of the Black Panther Party is going toe-to-toe with this government will never die. Never die.
Okay, so documentaries can be a little dramatic at times, but I think there is like we still live with a lot of the legacy of the kind of community programs that the Black Panther initiated, right? The free breakfast program, as I make the case, the like free lunch programs in schools today exist because of the work of the Black Panthers. That they began the first free breakfast programs. Then, because they were seen as a threat, the government begins adopting them into public schools. And so, I mean, it's still kind of an issue that they don't just feed kids for free, but that those programs come out of that. A lot of the clinics that the Black Panthers started still exist today, even though the party doesn't exist. Other community organizers, other organizations took over the running of those clinics. And so a lot of that community work that they did is still in existence today. On the other hand, I think it's not all the work of the FBI and the local police departments that led to the dissolving of the Black Panther Party. That had a lot to do with it. The founders of the Black Panther Party, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, were both in and out of prison and spent long times in jail during different times. Other members had been exiled to places like Cuba, to Algeria, which led to a lot of internal chaos within the Black Panther movement, because the way the organization was structured, it was definitely needed strong leadership at the top. And because of the FBI disinformation campaigns, by the time you get to the 80s or late 70s and 80s, a lot of what was left of the leadership of the Black Panthers didn't trust each other. Members didn't trust the leadership. And with the two founders gone and the trust so eroded, there wasn't really a whole lot of pathways forward. Some of the leaders tried to turn the Black Panther Party into a voting rights organization in places like Oakland that worked until the 80s. And then Hampton and Seale just kind of disappeared from the organization, and so that led to the breaking apart of the Black Panthers. Even though a lot of the members are still alive today, people like Angela Davis, for example, who was when she joins the Black Panthers in Los Angeles. That's when a lot of activists begin basically focusing on the work of the Black Panthers. In LA, there was a lot of different groups competing for which group was going to be like the main activist group in Los Angeles. And the Panthers ended up winning out in LA, but there was still a lot of divisions in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a place where activism is really political and always like fraught with internal fights, right? And then Huey Newton was shot and killed in 1989, and when he was killed, that was like basically by then the party was gone. So, okay, questions about the Black Panther Party? I haven't even covered this is just like a brief overview. If anybody is interested, I would strongly urge you to take a class like on the civil rights movement, which focuses a lot more on can spend more time on the Black Panther Party, or in African American Studies department. Those classes can oftentimes spend more time on it. There's also this book. I'm not being paid to advertise it. This is just one of the books that has come out in the last couple of years that I think is really good. And it's a graphic novel. So for those of you that are like, I don't have time to read long books, it's a graphic novel. And the artwork in here is really, really well done, I think. And it does a really good job of presenting all of the good things that the party did, along with the internal struggles that ultimately helped end it. So questions? No, but if anybody has questions, that you can always stay at the end of class. So I'm going to pivot now to talking about forced sterilizations, right? And in order to talk about forced sterilizations, we have to talk about a little bit about the history of birth control. and the birth control movement, because eugenics really is developed in the early 1900s, especially in the 1920s in the United States. But it's made possible specifically because of new technology that existed that can prevent people from getting pregnant and giving birth, right? Like the technology to do that had to exist first. And when we're talking about revolutionary technology that can be used both by activists who want it, but also can be used for eugenic purposes, we really have to start with the birth control pill, the hormonal birth control pill, right? Not that there weren't methods of birth control before, but because there were, right? The most effective method of birth control before the invention of the birth control pill was a diaphragm. Right, and it was really effective when used with spermicidal jelly. Now, has anyone ever seen a diaphragm? This is where this class turns into a little bit of a sex ed class, because I need to show you a picture. I forgot to include one in the slide because students often ask, what is a diaphragm? And I'm like, they still exist. It's just not the most popular method of birth control anymore. But this is what it looks like. It's like a cup that it's inserted, and the spermicidal jelly is used to kill the sperm as it's passing through the vaginal canal. So to use it, it could use very effectively. It would prevent pregnancy. It was really highly effective. It was close to 100% effectiveness in preventing conception, right? The second most effective method of birth control was the condom, right? By the 1950s, condoms were widely available and could be purchased at any drugstore, right? You could walk into any drugstore, purchase condoms. And by the 1950s, by the late 1950s, most people wanted some form of birth control, with the exception of Catholics. Now, Catholics are kind of an interesting exception because the church prohibits practicing Catholics from using any medical form of birth control, including things like condoms and diaphragms, the birth control pill. Nowadays, most Catholics ignore the Catholic Church on these issues, but it is technically still against church rules for Catholics to do this. And at the time, Catholics tended to actually not use methods of birth control, but that changes in the 60s. But okay, if I'm telling you there were really good, effective methods of birth control in the 1950s and before, things like the diaphragm and the condom, why was there still a need for the birth control pill? Because there was still, right? This is before the birth control pill is developed. And I'm going to tell you that most people were not using either a diaphragm or a condom. They just were not. Any idea or any hypotheses about why people would not use a diaphragm or a condom? See, this is where I'm like, I know you all are thinking of things, but this is like where the awkwardness of like sex ed classes comes out, even though this is not a sex ed class. But they were effective, Michael. I'm telling you, these were the most effective, and they were very effective. Even at the time, condoms were really effective. We're not talking about condoms of the 19th century, which were made out of things like animal skin, and were not wide use. At this point, the diaphragm and the condom were as close to 100% effectiveness as you can get with any method. Right? It requires proper use, but they're very effective. Marta, it wasn't even that. It wasn't even that. You know what it was? Okay, a problem that still happens with condoms now, that a lot of people don't like to use them because they feel weird, or because they think that it prohibits or affects the pleasure that you can experience in sex. That's one of the main reasons people even today don't like to use condoms, because they think it prevents some of the pleasure of sex. Well, then the diaphragm. Why didn't you use the diaphragm? The diaphragm, in order to get it, you needed to go to the doctor. Okay, you needed to go to the doctor, and it's a cup that gets inserted into the vagina. In order to get this cup, the doctor had to do an exam and basically fit you for a diaphragm, like a pelvic exam or a pap smear, the equivalent of those kinds of examinations. Now, I don't know how many of you have had a pap smear before, or a pelvic exam, but they are incredibly uncomfortable, and for a lot of women are painful. So most women, even though there was this diaphragm that they can go get from a doctor, didn't want to go get it. People weren't talking about sex. You didn't talk about sex with your parents. There was no sex ed in schools. So where were people supposed to figure out how to talk to their doctors about this? On top of it, doctors didn't like doing these exams on women. Like, in order to fit a woman for a diaphragm, a doctor had to like open up. And doctors didn't like doing that. They thought that birth control was not a medical issue, that it was like a personal sex thing. And this was a problem. This creates a barrier of people not going to the doctor to get it, and doctors not talking to their patients about the available birth control methods. Right? In addition, for things like the condom, they were male control, right? There were female condoms like there are today, but a couple of problems with female condoms. One, most people don't even know they exist. Most people, and if people do know they exist, they've never even seen one or used one. So the problem of knowledge and familiarity just was not there. And as a result, then a lot of women felt that it was a method they were not in control of, that they had to depend on their male partners to be willing to use the condom, and that a lot of men were just not willing to use a condom. There were STDs at the time, although STDs kind of exponentially grow after the 60s and 70s. In addition, in 1960, there were still 30 states that prohibited or restricted the sale or advertisement of contraceptives. So there were states where you could not buy a condom. Well, you could actually, they were pretty much everywhere, but you couldn't advertise for it as a form of birth control. Condoms were advertised typically as a method of preventing STDs or STIs. The diaphragm, you couldn't tell people about it. When the birth control pill is developed, it was technically illegal to advertise for it. So if you can't advertise, you couldn't even mail people information about birth control. It was illegal. So if a clinic, for example, wanted to mail people in the community birth control information, it was illegal, could not be done. In Connecticut, so this is the law that finally gets the contraception legalized in the United States. In Connecticut, there was a law that made the use of birth control drugs, so any kind of device or medical intervention, illegal and punishable by a fine of $50 and or a prison sentence of up to 1 year. So you could, in Connecticut, go to prison for a whole year if they could prove that you'd use a birth control method. That's the law. It's the Connecticut law. It was one of the most restrictive laws in the country that was used to challenge birth control law in the United States. So that case against birth control goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1965, the Supreme Court rules that Connecticut's laws was unconstitutional because, they said, it violated a married couple's right to privacy. The case was Griswold v. Connecticut. And this is the case that a lot of activists are talking about today because it's the same kind of legal reasoning that is used to make abortion legal. The legal idea was its privacy, that the Constitution mandates, gives us a right to privacy. And that this is about as private as you can get what happens in a couple's bedroom, right? Because now the Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade, by the way, now the Griswold v. Connecticut is in danger because the idea is they've already said that there is no right to privacy in the Constitution. So they could make birth control illegal again because that was the same legal reasoning used to make birth control legal. But okay. Initially, this right to privacy in matters of birth control was only for heterosexual couples. So technically, it was only legal for heterosexual married couples to use birth control. It's not until 1972 the Supreme Court finally makes it legal for anyone for any reason. Right. So initially, it was all tied into this idea of sex is not supposed to be something for pleasure. Right. This is an idea that at this point goes back at least 100 years. This idea that sex is only for reproduction. You only had sex if you were going to have kids. Well, that was an idea, a morality idea that comes out of Christianity. But in reality, that's not how people's lives function, right? People have been having sex for pleasure since humans have existed. But that kind of Christian morality, or religious morality, because it's in more than just Christianity, was embedded into these laws. And we get a lot of these laws from Europe, which had been heavily influenced by Christian, both Catholic and Protestant ideas. So that's why, like, the rights of gay couples and just of unmarried couples to have birth control kind of took longer. That other big thing, though, is doctors not thinking that birth control was a medical issue. Like, it seems so weird to think that doctors would not think that birth control was a medical issue, but they really did not, right? When they surveyed doctors, they found that 70% of non-Catholic doctors thought that family planning, it should be supplemental, not like it's something that they didn't talk about with every patient. Now, when you go to get checkups, they will ask you about this, sometimes a little bit too indirectly, but still, doctors will talk to you about methods of birth control and will ask about whether or not you're sexually active. Well, until the 60s and 70s and to more recently, doctors didn't think that they should ask you. They just did not talk to their patients about it. Right. So where did doctors think people were going to get information? They expected you would get information from your friends. And that works if you have friends who have good, accurate information. What happens if you don't have a friend that has good information? You just don't know. You just don't know, right? So doctors did not encourage women to use any form of contraception. The laws discouraged people from even looking for information. So that means that a majority of people, right, didn't have a good, reliable, effective method of birth control they were using, even though the technology existed. Right? This is where birth control activists come in, right? Birth control activists have been seeing this problem happening, and they saw how it particularly affected working class, poor women, right? Margaret Sanger was the leading birth control activist of the time. Now, I want to preface this by saying she was not a very nice person. I spent a lot of time reading her writings and the way she functioned. And let me tell you, she like forced her sister out of the birth control movement. Her sister was initially actually the most prominent birth control activist. And but she was jailed for protesting birth control law in New York. And after she's jailed, the sister negotiates with the cops to let her go, but only under the condition that her sister can no longer work in any birth control clinic or have anything to do with birth control. And it seems very clear that Sanger did that because she was jealous of her sister and the attention she was getting from the media. But her personal story is really interesting. Her mom had died after giving birth, becoming pregnant more than a dozen times. Her mom had a lot of children, and Margaret Sanger had seen the physical effects of so many pregnancies on her mother. Right? People don't talk about this, but being pregnant is a huge shock to the body. It's huge. I mean, your body changes in ways that you don't even realize can change. On top of it, she'd gone into nursing. Margaret Sanger was a trained nurse that had been working in the poorest neighborhoods of New York. And she saw how affected working class families were by being unable to control the number of children they had, right? Every child you have is another mouth to feed. And for poor families, having another child when you can't afford one, when you don't want one, places a huge economic burden. Right? And she was seeing this over and over again, women getting pregnant who didn't want to be pregnant and knowing that their family was going to suffer economically because of it. And so that's why she ends up dedicating herself to a life of advocating for access to birth control. She opens the first birth control clinic illegally in Brooklyn in 1916. Right? 1916, that's way before birth control is legalized. So she knows very much that opening a birth control clinic is illegal. But she's doing it anyway, right? She is harassed and shut down by the cops often. But she argued that the only way to achieve voluntary motherhood without abstinence was to have access to birth control information and methods, that people needed a place like a clinic, like a community clinic, where they can go and find the method that best worked for them and get the information they needed, because they were not getting it from their doctors. They just were not. Right. And this is, by the way, well before. Her birth control clinics are the foundation of Planned Parenthood today. Right. And Planned Parenthood has a lot of issues these days, but they were the first to provide birth control to American women. And her birth control clinics become a model. She ends up traveling all over the world, teaching other people all over the world how to open up birth control clinics. In the 1950s, she begins lobbying for an oral contraceptive. Right. She says there's a need, even though the diaphragm is there, even though condoms are there, she sees how people are just not using these methods. And so she'd already thought up of, we need a pill. It needs to be something really easy, really simple, where you can go to the doctor, get a prescription, and take a pill. That's it. She's like, it has to be something really simple so that poor women can do it. And they don't need to like follow long instructions. They don't need to be making multiple trips to the doctor. It has to be something really simple, like a pill. Right. But at that point, nobody's working on the birth control pill. Nobody, no pharmaceutical company, no doctor, no one's working on the pill yet. Right. We'll get to how that ends up happening. But she also promotes the fact that it has to be a medical issue. She says it's doctors that are the ones that need to be talking about birth control, and they're the ones that needed to be writing prescriptions for birth control technology. right? Because her background was in medicine, she firmly believes that this is a medical issue. So she's one of the people that will help make birth control into a medical issue, right? Because it's not before. Now, that's a bit problematic because like today, for example, it's harder to get birth control without going to a doctor first. And the idea is birth control can have side effects, but it's something that you should be able to get over the counter. A lot of times, like if your prescription runs out, then you have to wait for the doctor to be able to fit you in for an appointment. And all the doctor does is write a prescription. So it's an issue that these days a lot of activists are working to make it available over the counter because it's so commonly used today. But at the time, she's making the case that doctors are the ones who should be prescribing birth control. This is in part playing to her audience. She's talking to legislators who are afraid about what happens when there is something like a pill available to everyone. Like legislators, lawmakers were really afraid. What do you mean? Then people are just going to be having sex all the time. If there's no fear of becoming pregnant, women are going to be having sex, and we cannot have that, right? It was a morality issue that a lot of lawmakers were afraid of. So she is addressing that issue, that worried about morality, by making sure that it's going to be controlled by doctors. And also, a majority of doctors at this time were men. There were female doctors, but a majority of doctors were men. Right. So developing the pill. So you don't need to know all the details of it, right? Even this is already a very broad stroke of the technology. I mean, unless you're going to be a pharmacist or in pharmaceutical development. But by the 1930s and 40s, nobody was working on the pill, right? But we had the information, the research available to be working on it, right? By that time, scientists and researchers had figured out the physiology and the endocrinology of reproduction, right? All the knowledge we needed about how the body works, about the hormones, about pregnancy, all of that. We knew how that worked by the 1930s and 40s, right? That's important for developing a birth control pill. And chemists had figured out how to synthesize a more powerful analog of the natural progesterone, right? So the birth control pill is hormonal. And part of what it does is it kind of tricks your body into thinking it should not ovulate. Right. And so figuring out how to chemically produce those hormones and put them into a pill, that knowledge was there. Right. But you still needed a company willing to invest money into it and into actually making it. And none of the pharmaceutical companies initially want to touch this. Why? Why do you think? Because there's potential for making a lot of money, right? If you develop a birth control pill that's popular and widely used, you stand to make a lot of money. Well, why do you think not a single pharmaceutical company initially wants to develop a birth control pill? Fear authority. Yeah, one, it's illegal. Yes, Kenneth, they don't want the attention on them, and they don't want the bad publicity. Right? They know that being the first to develop, to even be working on it, would be something that would draw the attention of the public and of authorities, and they fear that it's going to hurt their image. But along comes Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was one of the main people advocating for, we need a pill, not a device, not another thing, we need a pill. And when she comes around, she has money. Not Margaret Sanger herself. She wasn't wealthy, but she has a friend that's willing to provide the funding needed to develop the birth control pill. And that was Catherine Dexter McCormick. She was a very wealthy individual, and she basically provides almost the entirety of the funding needed to develop and produce that initial birth control pill. And because of that, I think it's part of that why J.D. Seal was willing to work with them, right? They basically, they're the pharmaceutical company that is first willing to develop and produce the pill. But because they don't have to invest a lot in it, right? The funding is coming from this one person, and it's Margaret Sanger pushing all of this. So they do it. They develop the first birth control pill. And, they go through all the initial phases of testing and development. They get to the point where they need to start doing human trials, right? In order to get this pill on the market, it has to go through human trials. They're trying to figure out how to do this because it's still illegal in the United States to use birth control. So they're like, you would be breaking the law. And so they're trying to figure out. They finally decide that they're going to do the human trials in Puerto Rico. And that's for several reasons. One of the reasons was that scientists that are working on this have some connections to the university and the medical facilities in Puerto Rico. So that's important, having those relationships there. But there's also a lot of racist attitudes amongst the developers of the birth control pill. They wanted a population of poor, illiterate women. They want to test it on women who don't have a lot of education and who are poor. Because they think if poor, uneducated women can use this pill, if it's simple enough for these women to use it, then anybody can use it. In addition, since the trials in Puerto Rico were conducted, it has come out that the researchers didn't tell the women that were participating in the trial, like there was no informed consent, basically. They weren't told about all the dangers and potential side effects. And anytime that hormones are involved, there are dangers, right? The birth control pill is hormonal. There are people who can't take the birth control pill because of that. And for other health reasons, right? Hormones play an important part of our bodies. And they weren't giving the women all this information. There's at least one woman that died, and her death is connected to her participation in these birth control trials in Puerto Rico. A bunch of other women also potentially their deaths could have been connected to their participation in the trial, and then a whole slew of other health problems that some of the other trial participants had. The women have tried to sue the government over these birth control trials, and it's gone nowhere. Now, to you guys, that won't sound surprising, right? Given what we know about the way that other companies and the way the government has experimented on other poor people, poor and Black people. So that won't come as a surprise, but it's kind of a dark history that a lot of people don't know about the birth control pill. It was tested on poor Puerto Rican women and unethically tested on them. But all right, things went well with the human trials, and by May 1960, the FDA approves it for prescription all over the United States. And people begin using it. Now, there was some scaremongering at first about the pill because it's hormonal and because not a lot of people have used it. Like it's brand new product. So there were a lot of reports in the media talking about the side effects of it. And there are dangers, like when you take any other kind of medication, there's potential for side effects. And a lot of times it's a matter of finding the right hormonal dosage, right? And this is true for anyone that gets on the hormonal birth control pill or any kind of hormonal birth control, is that you have to find the right method and the right kind of dosage of the hormones. But it turns out that despite some of those side effects and potential dangers, there was such a need for a new method of contraception. That was SCC, right? It's you take a pill at the same time every day. So it turns out it was very easy to do it. And between 1960 and 1965, so just in 5 years after the development of the pill, there's a huge uptick in users of the birth control pill. Just huge, exponential growth of people using oral contraceptives, right? Of using the birth control pill. And part of the question is why? Like, you don't see this happening in other places. Like in Britain, it is very widely used, but and has this really massive appeal right away. But in places like France, for example, the birth control pill is introduced in the 1960s, and it's not widely used. The birth control pill doesn't become widely used in France until the 70s. So it takes about a little over a decade for the French people to accept the birth control pill. But in the US and in Britain, all it takes is 5 years. And almost everybody that can is using the birth control pill. Why? One, doctors like it. Doctors like it. Why do you think doctors would like prescribing the birth control pill over any other method? One, because they didn't have to do an exam for it like they had to do for the diaphragm. So they don't need to touch the patient in any way. And it was easy. They can just write a prescription for it. And it turns out most doctors in the 1960s and 70s were not even doing like a physical exam on people coming in for the birth control pill. They're just getting the prescription pad, writing the prescription, and off you go. The other big reason why is Planned Parenthood endorsing the pill, right? And using it at all of their clinics, right? Because Planned Parenthood had earned the trust of the communities in which they existed, right? Their endorsement goes a long way. On top of it, the Planned Parenthood clinics were offering it at cheaper prices. So anybody that wanted access to the birth control pill can. There are pathways to finding it, right? And getting it for cheap via Planned Parenthood clinics. Right? On top of it, all the controversy around it actually helps promote the pill, right? The company actually doesn't have to do any kind of marketing campaign for the birth control pill initially, because the newspapers, the media is doing all the advertising for it by talking about it over and over again. So people are finding out of its existence, going to their doctor, asking for it. The doctors are writing the prescription, and it makes the process so much easier than it had been before. Right. Now, it's not a magical pill, like not everybody can use it, but for the people that can use it, it's a huge deal, right? Especially for women, because now they can have sex with their husbands, with their boyfriends, out of marriage, within marriage, without that huge worry of there's a chance I might get pregnant. There's a chance I might get pregnant. And it just eliminates the fear of pregnancy largely, right? And that had been a huge fear, especially for women beforehand. It does not solve STDs, but remember, we're talking about the 60s and 70s. STDs are still not, the fear of STDs is not wide. Yeah. But no, it absolutely doesn't. And that's why, like, the campaigns, STD campaigns and sex education is so important even still, right? It's not just about preventing conception, but about staying healthy and preventing STIs. Yeah. But okay, the darker side of this birth control campaign is eugenics. The birth control pill opens up doors for eugenicists, right? These people had already been running around trying to develop technology, right? And in the 70s and actually 80s and 90s, but especially in the 70s, there's a growing fear that the planet is overpopulated, right? We're having too many kids, too many people on the planet, and we're exhausting the resources we have. So, and by the way, this is a conversation in the United States. Not every place in the world is having this conversation about overpopulation. But at the time, people in the US become very worried about overpopulation. So overpopulation, or the fear of overpopulation, does lead for people wanting access to the birth control pill, right? But this is also helps the eugenics movement, because they're like, aha, now we have a new technology that can help us control which people are reproducing and which are not. Right? There's two kinds of eugenics, positive and negative eugenics. Right? Positive eugenics is about promoting healthy genes. Now, for eugenicists, healthy genes means Aryan genes, white genes. Also, for anybody, healthy genes means no one with a disability. Right? So negative eugenics is about eliminating all the unhealthy genes, preventing people who are not white, who have a disability, from reproducing. Right? So it's not just about, hey, let's tell white people to have more kids. It's also, let's prevent unwanted populations from having more kids. Right? And it involves, the best way to prevent someone from having more kids from reproducing is through sterilization. Right? There's some different ways of sterilizing, but basically making it medically impossible for someone to have children. So what we see happening is an increased amount of sterilizations at public hospitals. Especially three main groups are affected: Latina women, Black women, and Indigenous women start being sterilized in the 70s at really high rates. Right? And this is part of the eugenics movement. There's also, sometimes people bring up, for example, that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. That's not quite true. She was a member of the eugenics movement for a couple of years. But I have to point out that anybody involved around birth control movement dabbled in eugenics at one point or another. So because she was one of the leading figures in this, it makes sense that she was at first interested in what the eugenicists were doing. But she wasn't one of those like hardcore, like Aryan supremacy, like eugenicists. Not to excuse her dabbling in it, because it's clear if you have any contact with eugenicists that these are not nice people, they're racist. And there's no doubt in my mind that Margaret Sanger held racist beliefs. It was very common in that era, but she was, I mean, she's no angel. However, she does not stay in the eugenics movement. She quickly leaves it and wants nothing to do with the eugenicist movement. But there is a connection, a very early connection between Margaret Sanger and the eugenics movement. It's there. Like, it cannot be hidden. She was a public figure, so it is well known that she dabbled in eugenics. Right. Some of the instances of eugenics, some that you might not even be aware of. There was a significant number of Latina women sterilized without their consent at the LA County USC hospital here in Los Angeles. It was a public hospital, so a lot of immigrant and Latina women didn't have access to healthcare. So when they needed healthcare, when they needed emergency care, the hospital most people went to in Los Angeles was LAC USC hospital, right? A lot of women would go in for delivery, to deliver a baby, right? They're pregnant and they're about to give birth, they go to the hospital. Well, it turns out that a lot of Latina women, especially women who couldn't speak English, were oftentimes, as they're being wheeled into the delivery room to give birth, paperwork is brought to them, it says, hey, sign this paperwork. There's some complications with your baby. We need to do these procedures, sign it. The paperwork was all in English. So for the immigrant women who can't read or write in English, it's gibberish. They don't know what they're signing. And they weren't being told what they were signing. Like nobody was explaining to them. The excuse was that, hey, we're in a rush to get to the delivery room and we need the paperwork signed. If you want the doctors to help you with this delivery, you have to sign the papers. Well, what they were signing was giving doctors permission to tie their tubes, right? What's commonly known as getting your tubes tied, which is medically is tubal ligation. It's going to prevent these women from ever having children again. A lot of those women, those Latina and immigrant women that going to this LA County hospital didn't even know this had happened to them. Like some of them would, give birth, get a tubal ligation, go home, and not know that it had happened. Right? Until maybe years later, they're trying to have another kid and they keep trying and trying and they can't get pregnant. And that's when some of them would go back to the hospital and figure out that they had been sterilized. Other women knew right away because if you know your body well, you know something's different. You did something more than just deliver a baby. And they would find out after the procedure was done, a tubal ligation was performed. And they're like, wait a minute, why, when? And it's too late to undo it. People don't realizing it. It's called getting your tubes tied commonly, but there is no tying of tubes. It's a burning off. So you can't undo that. Now, it's a huge impact for a lot of these women. The women end up suing the hospital in the state of California because this was done with other consent, right? And for a lot of them, they wanted more children. Like it was forced on them. They were not allowed to have more children. And why? So there was a whistleblower that gets the case made, that gets the media to talk about this and to get lawyers for the women. Well, it seems very clear. A majority of the doctors working at the LA County Hospital were white, and they felt that these were just immigrant women who were trying to take advantage of the system in California. That they were a burden on social services, and that they were having too many kids, and that they needed to be stopped and prevented from having kids. So it's a really racist attitude, right? This idea that it's immigrant women, they're having too many kids. It's a drain on social services. Because one, they don't know. They're making assumptions. They don't know that any women are actually using social services. They just don't know. They just assume because a woman does not speak good English or she doesn't speak any English, she must be a non-documented immigrant and we need to stop her from having kids. Like that was it. That was the extent of the research or the looking into things that these people did. And also, what is it to you? I'm like, so what if they are doing it? Like, what is it to the doctors? Their job is not. They're not politicians. They're not commentators, like they're doctors. They're there to provide the services that are being asked of them. And as a tubal ligation was not part of the service that these women wanted. It just was not. Has anybody seen the documentary? There is a documentary on these cases. It's called No Más Bebés. Has anybody seen it? No, sometimes high schools or other classes will show this. I might come in maybe next week then and show you a clip from the documentary. No, wow, okay. I'm like, because this happened right in LA. Similar thing happened in the 70s to Indigenous women. In Indigenous reservations and Indian reservations, the federal government is responsible for providing health care. So for a lot of people, for everyone living in an Indian reservation, they have access to whatever the closest public hospital is. Well, Indigenous women were using these hospitals for the health care, and we don't even know how many of them were sterilized without their consent. It has to be somewhere between 25 and 42% of Indigenous women in the 70s that were sterilized. It's hard to figure out because a lot of these doctors were getting consent, like they're getting signatures on the paperwork. And so tracking down these women is sometimes difficult, and getting them to admit that this happened to them is difficult because of all the stigma around it. Especially in the 70s, the stigma was that only loose women, only women who are cheating on their husbands and are having sex with tons of men, those are the only women that are getting sterilized, was the idea at the time. I said the other group that this was happening to was Black women in the South. Right, and this was happening much earlier. We know at least from the 1930s to the 1970s that a lot of Black women in places like Mississippi were going into the hospital, sometimes not even to give birth. Like one of the examples is of activist Fannie Lou Hamer. She went into the Mississippi hospital for removing of a tumor, a non-cancerous tumor in her uterus. She went in for the removal of a non-cancerous tumor in 1961. And she came out sterilized, having had a tubal ligation. Some women were coming in for things like that and then getting hysterectomies. The whole uterus removed. And doctors continued to do it. They just kept continuing to do it. Why? Why do you think nobody stops these doctors? Like in Mississippi, they're doing it from the 1930s to 1970s, and nobody does anything. It was widely known, right? Like Black women in places like Mississippi knew that you had to be careful when you went into the hospital because they might sterilize you without your consent. And yet no one did anything to stop it. So now you've read a lot about this kind of medical history. Why do you think no one did anything? I would suggest things like racism. It's clear on the part of a lot of these doctors that there was a lot of racism involved. Yeah, and Marta, there's no one to speak up in their favor. They know, hey, they can say something in the South. Who are they going to complain to? The white supremacist police department? The white supremacist politicians? They weren't going to listen to these women. They don't, Fernanda, they just don't care about these communities. They were vulnerable. Not well represented, right? There's nobody fighting for them. And so they're able to get away with these things. In California, Governor Newsom last year passed a reparations bill. He signed a reparations bill to pay reparations to any of the women that were sterilized without their consent. But I don't think it's widely known. So I don't know how many people have actually taken advantage of the reparations bill. Because they lost their court case. The Latina women lost their court case in California because they had signed consent forms. And it didn't matter that they were saying that nobody told me what I was signing. The doctor had the signature, therefore the hospital and the doctors go unpunished. Nothing happens to them. And now I'm going to stop the recording. I'm like, okay, I'm ending class in a depressing note.